So the first man was made to live in harmony with his creator and creation, which we call paradise. Adam and Eve were constituted in an original state of holiness and justice to share in divine life. Imagine that, to share in divine life. Fantastic. Which, by the way, we also were designed for that, right? We can have this. As long as he remained in divine intimacy, the man would not have to suffer and die. Okay, remember, we're in the image and likeness of God, right? And God, we can say, he has revealed himself to us as Trinity. So to a degree, the likeness of God has to do with a communion. All right? Between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so we can take the next step and say that man was also designed to live in such a communion, being part of God, being a sharer in his divine life. Therefore, we were designed to share in the life of the Trinity. Okay? In other words, if I am designed to share in the life of the Trinity and I don't share in the life of the Trinity, am I going to work properly? No. Any mechanical engineer will tell you that. Right? If I don't use the materials that require proper functioning, then why am I surprised that I don't function properly? Do you see where I'm headed here? In other words, man and God were not designed to be separated. It's part of what man's life was all about. And it wasn't a union that was designed to suppress man in any way. Is the Father belittled by the Son? Is the Son belittled by the Father? Is the Holy Spirit made less significant by the Father and the Son together? No. Neither do violence to the personhood of the other, but all the persons come together in a union where each person is dignified and held up by the other. So you have one God and three persons all in union. Am I making sense? And so now, if man is created in the divine image, then man is going to have a place in that union and function in a similar way, so that God would totally respect the personhood of the man, his individuality, his uniqueness, his freedom, his independence, while staying in union with God, man in response never operating in a way that would be disrespectful to the Holy Trinity that created him. And the Holy Trinity never being disrespectful to the man who was created. And life is then unable to function properly without such a union. All right? Am I making sense? Have I said it clear enough? You see where I'm going with this? Okay? Therefore, the Christian vocation is toward the lost intimacy, that lost union. Because of Jesus Christ, I have been given an opportunity to be reunited with the Holy Trinity. What's interesting is it's a gratuitous act of self-giving that brought life to man in the first place. And it's a gratuitous act of self-giving in Jesus Christ that returns to me my share of divine life. And it's even better than what Adam had, because I'm even more despicable because of sin than Adam ever was. I deserve it. And I receive it, and I don't get what I deserve because of Jesus Christ. Oh, happy fault, oh, necessary sin of Adam that gave me such a great Redeemer. The first man was freed from triple concupiscence, which enslaves him. Ooh, who invented concupiscence? The word. Anybody? St. Augustine. St. Augustine used the word concupiscence to describe a tendency for man to go against his nature, into sin. Concupiscence. I just said it. It's a tendency for the man to go against his nature. to hurt himself, to sin. Loosely speaking, a tendency to sin, because we're defining sin now as what does violence to my union with the Trinity, which impedes my ability to live the fullness of my humanity. You see? Am I making sense? Okay, yes. It's coming. There are three places. The triple concupiscences, there are three levels at which you are cooperating with concupiscence. Okay? There's concupiscence all over the place here. We got to get rid of it. Pleasure of the senses. Okay, that's one of them. Is pleasure wrong? No. Is there any pleasure that's wrong? Whoever said yes, you're wrong. All pleasure is good because it's all given by God. It's our misuse of pleasure that makes it wrong. It's when we use pleasure at someone else's expense, or when we inflict a harm on ourselves, or when we allow pleasure to disrupt our communion with the God who allows us to live our human life in all its fullness, you see. Covetousness for earthly goods is the second in the trinity of concupiscence. Are earthly goods wrong? No. And what we can see in the book of Genesis is that God created all the earthly elements to be under the dominion of man. One could almost say that the concupiscence dealing with covetousness is when we allow the earthly elements to dominate us by our desire for them. And so what you're doing is you're reversing the scheme of creation. And what you're doing is you're surrendering your God-given gift of having dominion. You see, one of the ways that I exercise dominion as a priest is I have sexual desires. And that's an earthly thing. And also it's a pleasure thing. But I have dominion, and I can say, they don't have to have control over me, because I can make decisions to not be manipulated and led by that. Because I am a rational human being created by God with a rational soul, and I don't have to be pulled along by those, because I have dominion over those things. And so I need to exercise the truth of my humanity in union with God. And that's how we deal with concupiscence. Self-assertion contrary to the dictates of reason. That's when we become tyrannical, an ogre, a despot. Okay? I assert my personhood contrary to the dictates of human reason, or I assert my authority. In other words, I misuse my God-given dominion. Did you notice in the creation story, did it say anything about man having dominion over the woman? It didn't, did it? So in other words, let's meditate on this a little bit. I'm sorry? It didn't say the opposite either. Exactly. It didn't say the opposite either. In other words, no, let's meditate on this a little bit. I'm just wondering if we can read into this, a little speculative theology here for the purpose of prayer and meditation, but I'm wondering if we can read into this and say, do we have dominion over any human persons? But yet, we might have the God-given right to have the authority of self-donating love over other people. Don't we? Isn't that how God chooses to deal with us? I have the authority to exercise my power of self-donating love. It's not dominion. Because we're made in His image, exactly. That's how He exercises His authority over us. And what's interesting is when I overstep my authority, and we're coming to this, when I overstep my authority and begin to make myself God over others, then we have a problem, don't we? Okay? Because I am unable to make decisions outside of my union with the Trinity. Reasonable ones. Okay. The great and terrible fall. We're going to have a little fun with this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. Now, here's the interesting thing. Who put the serpent in the garden? God did. Interesting. Interesting.
Unless man brought him.
Oh, no, no. Man did not bring the serpent in there. Everything was created. So the serpent comes from only one place. That's God. All right? Okay, let's play with this a little bit. If the serpent comes from God, okay, to a degree, man has to learn how to interact with creation using his freedom. Because remember, God made man free. And God is not going to enjoy a communion with man in the Trinity without freedom and without love. And so now you have creation coming together to help man be free. All right? And so I'm just asking the question here, is there an evil intent on the part of the serpent? We can debate that. Or is there, at the beginning here, an operation or an exchange with creation to bring the man into exercising his freedom? Interesting philosophical question. Something, again, to pray about. However, in the understanding of the devil, they call him the Satan, right? Satan, which in the Hebrew language means the tester. And that word tester comes up, tester or tempter, without an evil connotation, but more of a tester. Like, so we have, how many teachers do we have here? Okay, so we have teachers, right? Now, I don't know about you, but when I was in school, we had good teachers and bad teachers. It was that black and white, okay? But a good teacher would test you to make you stretch and grow and learn more. The bad teacher would give you an exam to trip you up and lower the grade scales, okay? So you had some teachers who were, you know, and I had some of those teachers. I'm sure they were evil. So sometimes there can be more of a malicious intent in testing. But the tester can also be there to enhance and grow. And so I'm just asking myself, that serpent put there by God, was that a missed opportunity for Adam to exercise his freedom? I don't know. Okay? We're going to look at an alternative to that in a minute. Okay? And what I think is also interesting is, up to this point, who has been in charge of the garden? Adam. And so now the beginning here is Adam and Eve decide to let animal rights have their way. But what you see, let's back up a couple slides. Covetousness for earthly goods and self-assertion contrary to the dictates of reason. All right? Created things are bringing the man to a point where he is making unreasonable assertions. Why? Because he's been created to live in union with the Holy Trinity, and he knows this. And he's being given an opportunity to live contrary to that. He should know better. Now, at the very least, Adam knows who put him in charge. And Adam and Eve know that their authority comes from a higher authority, and they also are in union with this authority, aren't they? At the very least, you would think that with this conversation of the serpent, they would have said, hey, Daddy, a little help here? And do you think he would have responded? Okay. Did God say, you shall not eat from any of the tree in the garden? So he enters into a conversation. There's a conversation, okay? There's a beginning of a use of reason here. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the tree in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You know what's going on here? You've seen this before. Well, I can't take it, but it's okay if I hold it for a minute. I can't take it out of the store, but let me hold it for a minute. And oh, I might forget that I brought it out with me. You see what's going on here? It's a seduction. It's the beginning of creating a compromise. It's allowing created things to take away my dignity of having dominion. And she says, the tree in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it or you shall die. What would die if she touched the tree? Her union with the Trinity. In other words, her life would cease to exist in fullness and death would follow. Why? Because it's her union with the supernatural that has elevated her above living creatures and empowers her to keep living. Am I making sense? Okay? And so what's the serpent doing? He's playing mind games, and he's getting her to compromise. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. A bold-faced lie. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Well, you know what? They already know what good and evil is. They know that they're created in union with the Trinity. They're created to live in union with God. They know that that's good. And they know that they take their life from Him. And anything else would be unacceptable. And so what's the serpent doing? He's creating a situation where they're offered the temptation of choosing to no longer share in God's power, to share in what has been given to them, but they are given an invitation, an opportunity to choose to take so that they can have power over Him. Am I making sense? Remember, everything up to this point, everything's been based on total self-giving. And now a new word is coming into play here. Taking. Self-centered. And he's even compromising their understanding of God's generosity. Like he's implying, well, you know that God's big concern is that, you're going to know what good and evil is and you won't need Him anymore. Well, you know what? That's exactly what He was trying to get him to do. You're going to know what good and evil is and you won't need Him anymore. He's trying to get him to make that jump. We don't need you anymore. Okay? You know something? Teenagers do this, don't they? At some point, they forgot that you gave them everything. And then pretty soon, they're thinking, all this you gave me? Come on, Mom, and Dad, you're behind the times. This isn't what I want. And you know what's interesting? After they grow up, though, they figure it out. My brother used to say, every year I get older, I realize more how smart mom and dad were. So these teenagers are doing their thing. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, covetousness, remember? The concupiscence of covetousness. When she saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, pleasure, fantastic. These are great tools to pull somebody in. And that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. To make one wise, didn't she already have all the wisdom of the Trinity? All right? But she wanted something on her own. She took the fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband Adam, who was with her. Here's an interesting detail. She took the fruit and ate it. She gave some to her husband who was with her. In tradition, they always call it Adam's sin. That always bothered me because who did the dirty deed here? Guys, why did we have to take this heat? I'm going to tell you why. Because it's right on. Adam is Adam. Now, at a cursory reading of the scripture, you can very easily go by this. Her husband who was with her. Her husband who was with her. He was right there. He was right there. Can you believe that that man let a serpent bother his wife like that? You know what, loosely speaking, do you know what the original sin really was? Wimpiness. Male wimpiness. The man losing his sight of his union with God and losing sight of his dominion over everything that God created and failing to exercise his God-given authority. Some say it was probably because he was afraid of the consequences of denying Eve. So, it's interesting, I've heard some writers say that Adam was in a theoretically a no-win scenario. At least he saw himself that way. And so he did what any reasonable fallen man would do. He gave in. He was headed there. Okay? He gave in. He wasn't fallen at the time, was the comment. But I'm wondering here is this. I'm wondering if he was fallen as soon as he didn't turn to the Father and say, Daddy, little help here. I'm just wondering.
There's no prayer.
Well, there's no prayer, or there's no, he wouldn't have had any understanding of prayer, but there's no, in other words, there's no reference to his communion. If he's in this communion with the divine, there's going to be an exchange between them, and it wasn't happening. All right? Now, what was Adam's mission? To care for and protect the garden. There are some scholars who have said the garden wasn't Eden. The garden was Eve, because that's where all life came from. And Adam had the seed. So you have some illustrations going on here. And so Adam failed in his God-given right to protect the garden. Probably because he may have been afraid for his life. And now what did he do? This is very, very complicated. But it shows you how complex the human person is. And it shows you how much we need the Holy Trinity. What was Adam doing? We're going to speculate a little here. We're going to have some fun. But was what Adam is, I'm thinking, placing his own life selfishly above Eve's, when he should have come between her and that serpent with his fanged teeth and said, you are going to get her only through me. And where was that reversed? On a tree. Jesus, who comes between death and his bride and sacrifices his life. Okay? At the very least, it seems like Adam asserted his selfish view of life, his self-centered view of life, concern for that safety, which to a degree is natural. You see how subtle all the sin is. I mean, there's a natural desire to preserve my life. And so, well, she ate the fruit, and she's not really going to die. I mean, it looks fine, so, what's the big deal? I mean, I live, she lives, the serpent leaves us alone, everybody's happy. She died, you die, the serpent dominates. It's all bad, it's all wrong. You're just, when you look at this in the context of the New Testament, the new Adam steps in between death and his bride. He did the job on a tree. It's just so beautiful. Okay, and so I'm just seeing what's going on there with different eyes. Am I making sense here? Are you following me? And so Adam needed to lay down his life for his wife. That's what he needed to do. Their eyes were open. They knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They hid in shame. They were no longer looking at each other in self-donation, but now they were looking at each other in self-interest, which is called lust. John Paul II would call the opposite of love not hate, but lust. Because why? If love, as in our Christian understanding of the world, if love in the vision of the Creator is about self-donation, lust is about self-appropriating at the expense of another self. And when you're in a relationship with somebody like that, you're afraid. And that's what was going on here. So sin is real and present in human history. That's what this tells us. Without knowledge of God, we cannot recognize sin, and therefore not recognize that the source of all human problems is alienation from God. We excuse ourselves from the life of the Trinity. In a sense, it's interesting. I had this insight here tonight. We were designed to operate on 4 quarters. And without the Trinity, we're only 1/4 human or 1/4 potential. Okay? And that's why. So you're alienated from God. You've lost your power. You've lost your life. The more religious we become, the more sin is not an issue. Right? The closer to God we get, the more sin is not an issue. Without the knowledge revelation gives of God, we cannot recognize the reality of sin clearly, and we are tempted to explain it as merely developmental flaw, psychological weakness, mistake, or consequence of an inadequate social structure. In sin, we have more than people going to hell. We have a diabolical plot to destroy all creation. Okay? And here's where it gets thick, Rosemary. Okay? If God had foreknowledge, and his ultimate desire was to elevate humanity into this state with him, and you had an angel who was second in command, and he could see where all this was going, and that these icky human beings would be giving him orders, do you think he was going to tolerate this? This is what's going on. Remember, the tradition tells us that Satan said, I will not serve. He didn't want to serve Christ because Christ was human. And if he didn't want to serve Christ, he didn't want to serve the Trinity. And if man was created to be in union with the Trinity and he didn't want to serve man, again, going from being a tester to a seducer, he didn't want to serve man. He was also out of sync with the Trinity. It's a diabolical plot to destroy all creation. So what's original sin? We can't grasp the story of the fall without the light of Jesus. And that's what I've been talking about. Have you noticed? You see all the connections to Jesus. Genesis chapter 3 then uses figurative language, but it does describe a real event. We were saying that earlier. So you have to be careful that this isn't a myth, or a better way to say it is this isn't mythology. According to, in biblical criticism, a myth is not defined in the same way as we describe mythology. A myth is a truth that's so profound that it cannot be articulated in mere facts, but it requires a more broad vehicle to help us understand it. And so one can say that this is a language that does describe something real, but it's figurative language at the same time. Okay? Am I clear? Okay. Free submission to God is renounced. And that's what Adam and Eve did. They freely renounced their submission to him. Okay, so, and remember, they accepted the authority of Satan over the authority of God. That's Adam and Eve should have appealed to their higher authority when making that decision in a conflict. And as I said earlier, this is what we do in moral conflicts. We know what the church teaches, we know what the commandments say, but we feel different, so we act that way. That's exactly what they did. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolically evokes that insurmountable limit of man. And here's another important thing. Man was not God. He was created to live in union with him. And so he had limits where God does not. And so with respect to those limits, he required growth, he required nurturing, but he also required this union with God. Man is dependent on his Creator and subject to the laws of creation and to the moral norms that govern the use of freedom. Okay? Remember what I said earlier. God doesn't unify himself with us to push us into submission and belittle us. He unifies himself with us to elevate us, to enhance our dignity. That's his agenda. I've come that you might have life and have it in abundance. Okay? Lack of trust in God led to man's disobedience. I trust in my feelings and what looks good over what God has asked me to do to stay in union with him. Man preferred himself to God. Okay? And you can see that a little in Adam. Okay? Adam maybe should have stepped in there, but he preferred himself to God. Eve preferred herself and the taste of this fruit to God. Man chose to be like God without God. That's a very cool statement. I like this. Right from the Catechism. Man chose to be like God without God. Adam and Eve lose the grace of original holiness. So here's the anatomy of Adam's sin. Paradise is lost, the loss of grace and original holiness, which would lead St. Paul to say, all have sinned and are fallen short of the glory of God. The harmony of original justice is destroyed. The control of the soul's spiritual faculties over the body is shattered. So in other words, I can no longer say to concupiscence, I'm in charge. I can no longer say to created things, I'm in charge. I have lost that ability. I let those things lead me instead. union of God and man and woman become subject to tension. Oh, isn't that real? Relationships become marked by lust and domination, hence the need for fig leaves. And harmony with creation is broken. You see how we do violence to the environment. Here's the great green statement. Death makes its entrance into human history. So these are all the effects of what has happened here now. By yielding to the tempter, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. They would transmit life in a fallen state. It is transmitted by propagation. Now notice what the Catechism said. That this original sin is translated by propagation. Okay? So that doesn't mean that propagation is bad. It's just now part of it, which is why we need baptism. Baptism regenerates. Human nature that has been deprived of original grace and holiness, that is perpetuated. Human nature has not been totally corrupted. It is wounded in the natural powers proper to it. Okay, that's very important. Okay? Human nature is not totally corrupted. In other words, in my core, in my being, I am good. I was designed to be holy. Right? So I'm not a total loss. Martin Luther used an image where he said that the human person was like a piece of dung covered over by snow or grace. Okay? That would go against our Catholic teaching. We would believe that we are flawed but good in our nature. Okay? There's the goodness there. So by nature I'm good in my metaphysical being. Okay? However, because of this corruption that has happened, I'm subject to ignorance, suffering, and the dominion of death. I am inclined to sin, and that sin, that inclination to sin, is what we call concupiscence. Baptism, by imparting the life of Christ's grace, erases original sin and turns man back toward God. Again, that was the problem, right? Adam and Eve turned from God, chose to separate themselves from Him, chose to absent themselves from 3/4 of their quality of life. But the consequence for the nature, baptism, by imparting the life of Christ's grace, erases original sin and turns man back toward God. But the consequence for nature, weakened and inclined to evil, persists in man and summon him to spiritual battles. All right? Now, insofar as Adam and Eve are required to maintain a relationship and a union with God, okay, we are required to do that, to maintain an equilibrium above sin. And that's where Jesus comes in. The world is now totally inundated by sin. And what Revelation makes known to us is confirmed by our own experience. For when man looks into his own heart, he finds that he is drawn toward what is wrong and sunk in many evils which cannot come from his good Creator. St. Paul talks about this in his letter to the Romans. I do what I don't want to do, but I can't help it, is basically what he's saying. And how do I get out of this? It's grace. It's the grace of Jesus Christ. He has broken the right order that should reign within himself as well as between himself and other creatures. Again, that's that right order. That's that union with the Trinity. Natural law is the cooperation of things of nature as God has planned, and these things are skewed by man. So we have a disrespect for natural law. And that's what sin causes us to do. In other words, okay, we use the example of contraception before, okay? So there's a consequence to inviting chemicals into you to inhibit creation. Here's an interesting example of, like, for example, premarital sex and natural law. The human body was designed for one partner. And natural law proves that. As soon as you enter a variety of partners, you escalate the chance of diseases and other kind of maladies toward the body. Right? That's a fact. And so what happens is, in our promiscuous society, which we think is wonderful, we're going against natural law, we're doing violence to ourselves, and you know what? We're doing it anyways. Divine law, God's ordinance known through revelation, are disregarded. Adam and Eve, they knew. They knew better, but they did it anyways. They are disregarded, and the human intellect is left unto itself. Okay? So I have an ability to reason, but when I absent myself from the wisdom of God, my reason is on its own, without reference to God. Where does that leave me? If my reason isn't being influenced by God, if my reason isn't referring to God, where would my reason refer to? Me. Me. And I don't know about you, but I am not qualified to run the world. And what I find interesting is, and I do this too because I sin, right? But what I find interesting is we keep telling ourselves that we're doing a great job running the world. And we keep telling ourselves we don't need to refer to God to do it, and we don't need His commandments in our government. Come on. We can do things fine ourselves. Have you watched CNN lately? Humans are directed to share in divine and eternal fulfillment. Human judgment is uncertain of itself. And human laws only regulate outward conduct. Human legislation can only heal the tendency to criminal activity. But it can't change the person, can it? Right? None of these things, none of our efforts can change the human person. So he, that is man, has broken the right order that should reign within himself, as well as between himself and other men and all other creatures. Natural law, the cooperation of the things of nature as God planned. Oh, we already did this, didn't we? Pressed the wrong button. Okay, so the cure to all this is Jesus. And this is why we need Jesus Christ. Because we keep seeing over and over again that we're not doing a great job on this. And it's not just about doing a great job, but it's about living fullness of life. I have come that you might have life in all its fullness, which Adam and Eve absented themselves from. It is reclaimed by Jesus Christ. Amen.